4 carriers, 6 minutes. That's how fast Japan lost the Pacific War. On a single morning in June 1942, when American dive bombers caught the Imperial Navy with its flight decks loaded with fuel and live ordnance. But the man who planned Pearl Harbor already knew this was coming. A full year before the first bomb fell, he told Japan's prime minister to his face, "I can win for 6 months. After that, we lose." His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. And in 1945, sitting across from American officers in a Tokyo interrogation room, Japan's surviving generals said he was right. But to understand how they got there, you have to start with the most famous quote Yamamoto never said. You've heard it. Everybody has. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." It's in the movies. It's in the documentaries. It's carved into the way Americans remember December 7th. And it was written by a screenwriter in 1970 for the film Tora. There is no record, not a letter, not a diary, not a single credible source, that Yamamoto ever spoke those words. What he actually said was worse. In 1940, a full year before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto sat across from Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe and delivered the coldest strategic verdict of the 20th century. "If I am told to fight regardless of consequences," he said, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." 6 months. That was the window. And the man saying it wasn't guessing. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He'd served as Japan's naval attaché in Washington. And during those years, he did something no other Japanese military leader bothered to do. He went and looked. He toured Detroit's auto plants. He visited Texas oil fields. He stood inside the actual machinery of American production and understood, with the certainty of a man who could do math, that Japan could not win a long war against the United States. The numbers weren't even close. America outproduced Japan 222-1 in oil, 17-1 in national income, 80-1 in automobile production. These weren't wartime projections. These were peacetime realities. Yamamoto had seen with his own eyes. So why did he attack? Because he wasn't given a choice. Japan's war cabinet had already decided. The military leadership believed they could seize the resource-rich Dutch East Indies and the Pacific Island chains, build a defensive perimeter so vast that America would bleed itself trying to cross it, and force a negotiated peace before the factories spun up. Yamamoto thought this was fantasy, but he was a military officer, and when the order came, he obeyed. So he's his audacious naval strike in modern history. Not to conquer America, but to wound it so badly it wouldn't want to fight. That's the part most people miss about Pearl Harbor. It was never an invasion plan. There were no troop transports heading for the West Coast. Japan didn't want American soil. Japan wanted American despair. Sink the battleships, the towering public symbols of naval power, and the shock would be so total, so humiliating, that Washington would negotiate rather than spend years clawing back across 8,000 miles of ocean. December 7th was a tactical masterpiece. 8 battleships hit, 4 sunk, nearly 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet crippled in a single morning. But Yamamoto had missed something critical. The American aircraft carriers. The ships that would actually decide the war weren't in port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. They survived untouched, and that single stroke of timing would haunt Japan for the rest of the war. For exactly 6 months, Yamamoto's prophecy played out like scripture. Japan ran wild. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in a week. The Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, the Solomon Islands, all of it taken. By spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe, and in Tokyo, the mood was euphoric. Every victory confirmed what the war cabinet believed. The Americans were soft, the perimeter was holding, and the negotiated peace was just a matter of time. Yamamoto knew better. He'd given them 6 months. The clock was ticking, and on April 18, 1942, 4 months and 11 days after Pearl Harbor, it ran out in the most unexpected way imaginable. 16 Army B-25 Mitchell bombers roared off the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet, 650 miles from Japan. Twin-engine land bombers, planes never designed to launch from a carrier deck. The mission was led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, and on paper, it made almost no military sense. 16 medium bombers couldn't seriously damage Tokyo. They didn't have enough fuel to return to the carrier. Every crew member knew this was a one-way trip. Bomb Tokyo, then crash land in China, and pray you reach friendly territory before the fuel runs out. The physical damage was negligible. About 50 people killed, a handful of buildings destroyed. But the psychological damage was an earthquake. Japan's military leadership had assured the emperor and the public that the home islands were untouchable. No enemy aircraft could reach Tokyo. And then, on an April afternoon, American bombers appeared over the rooftops. Twin-engine planes that shouldn't have had the range, launched from a ship that shouldn't have been close enough, hitting a city that was supposed to be safe forever. The high command was shaken to its core. By some accounts, Yamamoto was so disturbed, he stayed in his cabin for a day. The Naval General Staff, the same men who had dismissed his warnings about American capability as unreasonable, suddenly couldn't dismiss anything. If American bombers could hit Tokyo once, they could hit it again. The defensive perimeter had a hole in it, and that panic drove Japan straight into a trap. The Doolittle raid didn't destroy Tokyo. It destroyed something far more dangerous: Japan's strategic patience. The high command became obsessed with eliminating the threat of another carrier strike on the homeland. To do that, they needed to destroy the American carrier fleet. Yamamoto proposed a decisive battle at Midway Atoll, a tiny island halfway across the Pacific, designed to lure the remaining American carriers into a fight Japan couldn't lose. On paper, the odds were overwhelming. Japan committed 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, plus a screen of battleships and cruisers against America's 3: Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet. More planes, more experienced pilots, more ships. This should have been the knockout blow. It became the catastrophe. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible position. They'd been preparing to launch a second strike on Midway Island itself, when intelligence suggested American carriers were nearby. The order came to switch from ground attack bombs to anti-ship torpedoes, a process that meant hauling ordnance up from the magazines, stripping current weapons, and rearming every plane on the flight deck. The hangars were chaos: fueled aircraft, loose bombs, and stacked torpedoes crammed into spaces never designed to hold all of it at once. That's when the American dive bombers arrived. 37 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown screamed down through broken cloud cover and found the Japanese carriers with their decks covered in armed, fueled aircraft and piles of exposed ordnance. The bombs hit, and the carriers didn't just burn, they detonated. Aviation fuel, loose torpedoes, and stacked bombs turned the hangar decks into chain reaction infernos. Kaga was hit first, then Akagi, then Soryu. 3 carriers mortally wounded in approximately 6 minutes. Hiryu survived long enough to launch a counterstrike that crippled the Yorktown, but American planes found her that afternoon and sent her to the bottom too. In a single day, Japan lost 4 of its 6 frontline fleet carriers and the core of its veteran naval air crews, losses it would never, not once, for the rest of the war, replace. Midway didn't end the war, but it ended the argument. Every battle after June 1942 was fought on America's terms, at America's pace, with America's resources, and those resources were beyond anything Japan could comprehend. By 1943, the United States had 22 aircraft carriers under construction. Japan had 3. In 1942 alone, American factories built 49,000 aircraft. Japan built 9,000. Over the full course of the war, the United States produced 325,000 combat aircraft, to Japan's 76,000. And it wasn't just aircraft. America launched Liberty cargo ships so fast that the construction time dropped from 244 days to a median of 39. And in workers assembled one from 250,000 parts in 4 days, 15.5 hours. At peak production, the United States was launching 3 Liberty ships every single day. The 24-ship Essex-class carrier fleet was so dominant that not a single one was lost to enemy action in the entire war. The production gap didn't just tilt the war. It made it unanswerable. Japan lost carriers it couldn't replace. America replaced losses many times over. Every Japanese victory evaporated. Every American setback was temporary. And the man who knew this best didn't live to see the proof. Yamamoto was killed on April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raid. American P-38 fighters ambushed his transport plane over Bougainville. They knew his exact flight path, because U.S. codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval cipher. The architect of Pearl Harbor was hunted down by the very industrial intelligence machine he'd warned his country about. He was dead at 59. But even Yamamoto's death couldn't change the arithmetic. Nothing could. Japan's only weapon to ever kill Americans on the continental mainland was a paper balloon. Starting in late 1944, Japan launched roughly 9,000 balloon bombs, hydrogen-filled paper spheres called fugo, designed to ride the jet stream 6,000 miles across the Pacific and drop incendiary devices on American forests and cities. A few hundred reached North America. The U.S. government imposed a total media blackout. Not a single newspaper reported the landings, because they didn't want Japan to know any had arrived. And then on May 5, 1945, near the small town of Bly, Oregon, a pregnant Sunday school teacher named Elsie Mitchell took 5 children on a church outing into the woods. They found something strange on the forest floor. A road crew worker nearby, named Richard Barnhouse, heard what came next. There was a terrible explosion, he said. Twigs flew through the air, pine needles began to fall. Elsie Mitchell and all 5 children were killed. They were the only people killed by enemy action in the 48 continental states during the entire war. Japan's furthest reach into America, 6,000 miles of ocean, crossed by a paper balloon, killed a young mother and 5 kids in an Oregon forest. That was it. That was all Japan could touch. Meanwhile, a submarine, the I-17, had shelled an oil field near Santa Barbara, California, on February 23, 1942. About 25 shells lobbed at the Elwood facility. A skeleton crew heard the thuds and thought something had blown internally, until someone spotted the long, dark shape of the submarine sitting offshore, its deck gun flashing. The damage was minor. The shelling happened, by coincidence, while President Roosevelt was delivering a fireside chat on the radio. It was the first time the American had been shelled by a foreign power since the War of 1812. A submarine, paper balloons. That was the full extent of Japan's ability to strike the American homeland. Against that, America was building 3 warships a day and producing aircraft at a rate of nearly 90,000 a year. So here's the question the title of this video asks. And here's the answer in their own words. In the autumn of 1945, officers from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey sat down in Tokyo with Japan's surviving admirals, generals, and government officials. These weren't casual conversations. They were formal interrogations, recorded in official documents, still publicly available through the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command. And the question was direct. When did you know the war was lost? Their answers all pointed to the same conclusion. Japan's leadership knew, or should have known, that the war was unwinnable almost from the beginning. The industrial gap was too wide. The resource gap was too deep. Yamamoto had told them so in 1940. Midway had proved it in 1942. And by 1944, the arithmetic was so lopsided that continuing to fight was no longer strategy. It was denial. Prime Minister Suzuki's own secretary, a man named Sakomizu, secretly compiled a report in May of 1945, analyzing whether Japan could continue fighting. His conclusion was unambiguous. It could not. Aircraft production was collapsing. Shipping had been strangled. Food supplies were failing. Anti-war sentiment was rising even among the military. Suzuki read the report, agreed with it, and quietly carried the verdict to the emperor. Japan surrendered in August 1945 with approximately 2 troops still under arms and nearly 9,000 aircraft still operational on the home islands. Not a single American soldier had set foot on Japanese soil. The invasion, Operation Downfall, was never needed. Military planners had estimated that an invasion of the home islands could cost between 250,000 and 1 million Allied casualties. Your fathers, your grandfathers, the men of that generation who were already being staged for the landing, they never had to go, because Japan's leaders admitted on the record that the war was over before the invasion came. The admission wasn't forced by a single bomb or a single battle. It was forced by the same thing Yamamoto had seen 25 years earlier, standing in a Detroit factory, doing the math in his head. America couldn't be invaded. America couldn't be outproduced. America couldn't be outlasted. And the man who understood that best was the man who attacked it anyway, because his country wouldn't listen. The most famous quote from Pearl Harbor was written by a screenwriter. The real quote, the one that actually matters, was spoken by a man with 2 missing fingers, a Harvard education, and the certain knowledge that the war he was about to start was the war he could not win. I shall run wild for the first 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year. He was right about both parts.